Teach me to perform my duties diligently, with my attention fully riveted on Thee. Teach me to love Thee as the worldly man loves his possessions. With the first love of true lovers, teach me to love Thee.
Oh, good morning again. Welcome to everyone online too. This is a reading from Rays of the One Light, Commentaries on the Bible and the Bhagavad Gita by Swami Kriyananda. This is week 37. Truth invites, it never commands. Truth is one and eternal. Realize oneness with it in your deathless self within. The following commentary is based on the teachings of Paramhansa Yogananda. Free will is a basic principle of life. God never coerces. He invites us to live in such a way that we find fulfillment in ourselves. If we refuse to live rightly, Paramhansa Yogananda taught, God simply says, I will wait. We have eternity to live. In that eternity, we live as we choose, in self-created darkness, a darkness as intense and as long-lasting as we choose, or in the infinite light, the true self, which is God. Jesus Christ in the Beatitudes offered a beautiful example of God's way of inviting mankind to seek perfection, not only by commanding, but by offering His human children the incentive they need to choose the right of their own volition. Blessed are the poor in spirit, Jesus said, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. In each of the Beatitudes, Jesus explains the blessing attendant upon observing it. The divine way, similarly, for each of us, is not to do violence to our own natures. Spirituality must be attained naturally. It can never be attained by force. The Bhagavad Gita in the 3rd chapter says, even the wise behave in accordance with nature as it is manifested in them. Of what avail, then, is suppression? The scripture goes on, however, to explain that this doesn't mean that we should surrender to the dictates of our lower nature. Rather, it emphasizes our need to aspire to the heights, but each of us in accordance with his own nature, and not in imitation of anyone else's, offering ourselves up for purification by divine grace. Desire, whatever form it takes, so the Bhagavad Gita explains, should be resisted, even if only mentally. This is the Gita again. Attachment and repulsion to sense objects, both of these are universally rooted. No one should accept their influence, for verily they are man's enemies. Thus, through Holy Scripture, God has spoken to mankind. Om, Om, Om. This title of this topic, Truth Invites, it doesn't command, reminded me of a couple of stories from high spiritual masters. Sri Krishna, at the end, or very close to the end of the Bhagavad Gita, which is this discourse giving to the ideal disciple, Arjuna, this entire gift of beautiful teachings for how to realize yourself and come to God. And Krishna says to Arjuna, who says to all of us as disciples, now that I've given you the secret of secrets, this teaching that is so deep, after you reflect exhaustively on it, do whatever you desire. Essentially, I'm sort of paraphrasing, essentially Krishna's saying, after giving one of the greatest teachings in world history that has influenced and helped millions of people for hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years, after giving this wisdom, he essentially says, do with it what you will. He doesn't command, he doesn't say you got to do this, you got to practice this, practice this. This is the type of invitation that truth gives, that God gives to us all the time. I'm sure that all of us are here in this room or watching online. At some point you had an invitation to these teachings, and you were open to them, and maybe they came to you at the right time. There's a fellow Gurabai who lives at the village, Hashi. I think some of you know her. She tells a story when she was, it must have been in the early 70s, she was living in what she called a blend between a hippie commune and a ashram in southern Illinois with, I don't know, maybe a dozen people that were attuned to the teachings of Yogananda and aware of Kriyananda's and Ananda's teachings, and they were trying to form a community. And so they invited Kriyananda to perform a wedding of a couple that was living there, and Swami came on his way back from the East Coast and stayed for a few days and did the wedding. And the wedding was in a Catholic church, so it was done by both Kriyananda and a priest, Catholic priest. And when Swami was leaving, they were about to take him in the car, and there was one member who wasn't present, so they said, oh, so-and-so's not here, and he said, I would like to say goodbye to him. They said, no, let's get you to the airport. And he said, well, I don't want to leave without saying goodbye. And in that lull while they were waiting, there were some people that felt like the commune or the community wasn't moving forward enough, and there was other people who were pretty happy with how it was. And so they asked him, how can we grow in this work? How can we improve our practice in our community? And they were all people that were very new to the path. And Swami just said, well, why don't you come live at Ananda? And you can always come back here later. Just a real light invitation. Turned out that 4 of those people did come and live at Ananda. He didn't say, you're not going to make it as this small community. He just laid out this invitation. And that's what God does for us, is lays out these invitations. The Beatitudes that are talked about, and some of them are quoted here in the reading, these are Christ's way of telling us, here's the best attitude, really the best consciousness to be able to receive higher consciousness, and here's the rewards that you'll get from them. That's what the Beatitudes lay out, and it's beautiful. And in the Gita, is talking about behaving according to your nature. You guys can't see it, but nature is capitalized, capital N, nature. So he's talking about your highest nature being a guide for you. That you can't, and the other part, to what avail then is suppression? suppression of your nature. And suppression is, unfortunately, a big part of our consciousness in this culture right now. There's all kinds of ways that, especially in the media and in social media, that we're trying to suppress other people. So the idea that maybe suppression isn't going to work for me in my individual spiritual growth is kind of a radical idea given the consciousness that we have right now of, cancel culture and, I mean, it's just rampant. I'm not on social media, but some of my closest people are, and so I hear about some of these ways that people tell each other, if somebody doesn't behave a certain way, your boyfriend doesn't do something the way you think it should be done or the way that culture thinks it's done, you just dump them. You just cancel them. I had a student in my office a week or two ago in tears. She was coming off of her clinical rotation, and I'm her professor for that experience. And she was very concerned that the comments that her clinical instructor had put on the final evaluation document was going to somehow follow her and affect her negatively, like when she applied for a job. She graduated, got licensed, applied for a job. And I reassured her that no, in no way is this available to anybody. We do send it if you try to get licensed in another state, and that's why I think she started off. Her mind went there because I think she's so engrossed and involved in this cultural thought form that is so dominant that you have to suppress things if you don't like them. and so this from the Gita, from Krishna saying, you need to act according to your nature. Everybody's nature is a little bit differently. Suppression doesn't work. And really, suppression has a couple of problems with it, at least two that I can think of. One is it only deals with the symptoms, symptomatically. It's only superficial. I spent much of the last 10 days with my mother who's on hospice trying to get the caregivers to not just give her opioid medicines because she's having leg pain at night. And I'm quite sure, I'm not a physician, but I know a fair amount about this. I'm quite sure that, and know her history, that the problem that's causing her leg pain that's so severe and wakes her up at night is arterial insufficiency. You've got a little bit of blockage of blood flow, and after a few hours in bed, it becomes very painful. So the opioids they suppress the pain, but they don't get at the root of the problem. And in the same way, when we go to think about our spiritual challenges, we need to get at the base of the problem, which is consciousness. The other problem with suppression is that it doesn't allow any room for alternatives. So when we go to think about changing something we don't like, we're cut off. If we go at it with suppression, we're cut off from what do we do instead? It's very hard with our habits, it's very hard to just, bam, end a habit. What are you going to do instead? I'm going to have dates around the house and so that I don't eat the chocolate bar so much. That I can start to move in the right direction. It reminds me of the story of Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi, great spiritual political leader of India and the Indian independence, who I believe received Kriya from Yogananda. he was known as a great renunciate because he worked, and he was very public about how he had to struggle to renounce his likes and dislikes, his attractions. And so a mother brought her young child to him and said, "Tell my kid to quit eating so much sugar." He really liked sweets, really into eating lots of sweets. And Gandhi said to her, "Come back in a week." Because what he wanted to do was deal with his own attraction to sweets and see how that young child could help with that desire and that attraction. So, attachment and repulsion are two things that we're warned against, that they're universally rooted and that they are our enemies. Attachments are difficult to deal with unless and until we have some glimpse, some feeling about what it is that we feel that we will have or be if we get that object. If I get that new car, or if I get whatever it is. If you think about any of your things that you're attached to, like I'm really attached to my pillow. I have a great wool pillow, and I usually bring it when I travel because it's a great pillow. I'm attached to it, and it helps me, but I don't have to have it. I can still sleep. My life will still be okay without it. Our attachments, if we think about them, I'm talking about the bigger ones, bigger than pillows. The bigger ones, there's probably some feeling that we can get when we think we have that or when we obtain it. That is a place of power or consciousness or wisdom. I think this is partly why in our day-to-day lives we don't get to find that. We go on with the help of our habits being attached to the things that we're attached to. When I was doing the yoga teacher training for 2 weeks up at Ananda a few years ago, I was pushing a 60-year-old body through the yoga several hours a day, the yoga postures, and I was getting pains and little familiar pains, in the knee and wherever, tightnesses. And I had the experience of just going into that pain and just creating an energy flow. And it would go away. And I could go on at a very high level. And I'm not saying that once I've come home and, a few years later that I'm able to do that every day or every time. Most of the time I can't. But I've had a glimpse of what it feels like to be connected to that consciousness. And I think this is why it's so beneficial to go on pilgrimage for so many of us, because you take yourself out of your usual life, or even take seclusion, or even doing a yoga class. It can take you out and give you that experience of contacting what it is you otherwise might be seeking by whatever you're attached to. So attachments, yes, I think we're familiar with that. Repulsions is an interesting addition, because Krishna says our repulsions are just as bad as our attachments. And it must be because they're both aspects of delusion. we talk about likes and dislikes, and so likes and dislikes, attractions and repulsions are kind of the extremes of those. I saw a little cartoon the other day of two snakes. Some people think snakes are repulsive. Two snakes, and they were cuddling with each other, and one of them says to the other, says, "Of course, you silly thing, I still think you're repulsive." Or, "You silly thing, I still find you very repulsive." and it's true, because to the extent that we feel repulsed by people or things or even our own difficulties, there's still that necessity to find a place in your highest consciousness about what that is about. And that seeking of it is what these readings are about, what the invitation is from the Beatitudes. And that seeking, because we can't use a repulsion in order to try to get rid of an attachment. We can't try to say, I'm repulsed by this. And a lot of times there's a little bit of mix of both in these things. We're kind of attracted to something, but we're also kind of repelled by it. But we can't take a sledgehammer of, I'm going to make this repulsive, and therefore I'm not going to have the attachment. We still have, because they're both delusion, we still have to transcend those at the consciousness level. There is an important context to this, which is about the fact that whether we're successful at any given time in detaching from something that's not healthy for us, that's part of delusion, whether we're successful or not, is not even really the important thing. The important thing is that we have the consciousness and that we continue the effort. Because the spiritual path will get deeper and deeper for all of our lives, for all of our successes, for all of our failures. I recently rewatched a movie called The Darkest Hour. It's about England in World War II and about Winston Churchill. And Britain is basically on the verge of being invaded by Germany. Almost their entire army of 300,000 soldiers are stuck on a beach in Dunkirk across the channel. And defeat looks imminent, and there's all this pressure to negotiate, to say, hey, we don't want you to invade, let's negotiate a peace. And all of Europe has been overrun in a very short time. And I think many of you know the story that they garnered basically a civilian navy of any ships, boats that were 30 feet or larger to go across the channel, and they were blessed by the cloud cover so that the German airplanes couldn't bomb them. And they got most of those 300,000 soldiers out, and of course went on to be victorious and not be invaded. But there's a quote from Churchill. I don't know exactly when the timing of it was. He says, let me see if I can get it right. He says, success is not final. Failure is not fatal. It is the courage to go on that matters. This is such a high place, for all of Winston Churchill's difficulties and foibles. This is a a wisdom from that high place of consciousness. Because where else do you know that failure, especially in a war, is not fatal? The soul is not fatal. The soul never dies. Where else would you know except on a long spiritual journey that you're going to have successes and you're going to have more successes and other successes, and you can't just rest on one success. So success is not final. Failure is not fatal. The courage to go on. And this is for us the courage about finding that higher consciousness amongst our attractions, finding those invitations from God to us. God is not thrifty with his invitations. They're probably raining down on us all the time. But they are subtle. May we all be blessed to continue this journey. I'm so blessed to be on the journey with you. God bless.